Well, all right, coming to the microphone, you have me, your friendly neighborhood Rabbi John Carrier here, and joining us on the chat this evening, we've got some Jew-curious people, some heroes just like you who have questions about this topic, the topic being the synagogue service, what to expect if it is your first time attending a synagogue service, or maybe the first time in a new place. Maybe you're going someplace that is different from a place you've gone before, and you don't know if it's going to be the same or different. But in any case, going to a synagogue for the first time can be a very different experience indeed. And so that's why I wanted to host this live Q&A session. Before we go to the Q's for some helpful A's, I hope, we're going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of services you might go to, whether you're going on a Friday night for the first time or a Saturday morning for the first time, or even a weekday service. If you have a reason to go to a weekday service and you want to know if it's going to be 3 hours long like this Saturday morning service is, short answer, no, it's not, probably. So we're going to talk about all that tonight. Love to see what questions you have about the Jewish synagogue service. It's kind of redundant, Jewish synagogue. Synagogues are usually, by definition, Jewish, in my experience anyway. But I'm dying to see what questions people have. If you are joining us in the chat, please feel free to give us a shout out. Say who you are, where you're coming from, and just start asking questions. I'm going to talk for a little bit, but then I'll take a pause from time to time to check out those questions, give you the very best answers I can. Sometimes, I don't know everything. I've been studying this stuff for a long time, but sometimes there's questions I can't answer, and I may have to get back to you on that. I may throw some references up in the comments. If you are watching this video in the recording after the live session and you have questions that were not answered, please feel free to put your questions in the comments below the video. Let me just make sure. It sounds like everybody can hear me out there okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Sound check, sound check. Microphone 1 2 1 2. That's just an example of me counting to 2, as Strong Bad might say. But very happy to see everybody. We got Ruthie in the house tonight. We got Kathy in the house tonight. We got multiple Ruthies. I think that's Whitney over there. We got Suzanne in California. Good to see you. We've got all sorts of great Jew-curious people jumping in. Sound is coming through good and clear. Thank you, heroes. If you have questions before we even get started, make sure you go ahead and throw those in the chat so I have a little bit something to come back to. And if we'd have no questions to start with, here's a good one. Why isn't the Siddur in order? They seem to jump forward and miss things in the Siddur. That's a great question. I'm going to make sure I come back to that. Sometimes, the Siddur is there to give you all the prayers you might possibly say, and not every congregation says all the prayers you might possibly say. Different places have different customs, and a Siddur is supposed to be kind of a compendium guide there for you, but can also be a bit of a choose-your-own adventure. That's why it's helpful to go back to a place over and over again, get to see what their minchag, what their custom is, and that's why it's also helpful sometimes when people announce page numbers. Not every place will announce the page numbers. They just want you to keep up. That's a different style, totally legit, but sometimes people will be helpful and tell you what page we're on, or if you have no idea, don't be shy to ask somebody there, what page are we on? And in really nice, friendly places, what they'll do is they'll hand you their Siddur, their prayer book, already open to that page. So before we get started, just because we're talking about holy things that come to us from our Torah, I'm going to go ahead and say the blessing for Torah study, and it goes a little something like this. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And you could say amen on your end or type amen in the chat. You do you. We're going to get started here. Before we do, I just want to give special acknowledgement. If you are watching this video as one of my videos for the first time, you should know that on this YouTube channel, I have, I think, over 160, 170 videos at this point about various Jewish topics, including some of these long-form Q&A discussions, as well as videos that are as short as like 90 seconds. It's one of my most popular videos is the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, in 90 seconds. So check that out. You should also know that this is being recorded for the Jew Curious Show podcast. This Q&A, sometime in the near future, The sound will be harvested and then released as a podcast. This is a little experiment in a way for me to podcast in an interactive way. It's like, how do you have a choose your own adventure radio show? I don't really have a call-in show for the podcast, but this is a way that people with questions, Jew-curious people such as yourself, can interact live and then have this be on a podcast that is available on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Google Play, wherever fine podcasts are given away for free. So with that, I'm going to check out the chat, see if there are any other questions to start with. I found, let's see, this is Whitney saying, I found an Orthodox synagogue that I can actually walk to, but I'm intimidated to go to service. What can I expect? I usually go to a Reformed synagogue. Thanks. Well, I'll tell you the first thing you can expect is that most likely all the women will be sitting in one section and all the men will be sitting in a different section, and that will be immediately obvious to you when you enter. So I highly encourage you to check this service out. I don't think they'll be any less welcoming to you, but you should, if you're a woman, you should sit in the women's section. If you're a man, you should sit in the men's section. If you have a problem with mixed seating, an Orthodox synagogue is not a place to air those grievances. That's just the custom of the place, and many people are terribly comfortable with that. And I know when I go to Jerusalem especially, there are lots and lots of different synagogues there that I love. Most of them happen to be Orthodox because most of the synagogues in Jerusalem are Orthodox. I go to Reform or Conservative or non-denominational places as well. It happens that some of my favorite places as far as how they pray, the Torah that the rabbis teach, the singing that they do, those places happen to be less egalitarian, let's say. So I would encourage people, even if you don't have, I'll say, an Orthodox frame of mind, to check out all sorts of different prayer spaces, including Orthodox prayer spaces, and see if they are for you. There was one summer where my sons and I did a little experiment. We went to different synagogues. We went to a different synagogue every single Shabbat because we lived in a place in Los Angeles where you could. And their favorite place was the Orthodox synagogue because they pray really quickly and they're done early. So we were done with Shabbat morning by 11:30, and they had meat cholent at the Kiddush. So that's a rare treat if you can find it. However, I dig that not everybody's welcome. I dig that not everybody feels welcome in these spaces. Not everybody feels welcome to either that theology or the separate seating. That's okay. I don't judge you at all. But I will say, if you came to one of these prayer spaces, as long as you looked around and kind of just blended in or went along with the traditions that you found there, it could be a very good experience for you. So check that out. Don't be afraid to shul shop, that's a very legit Jewish thing to do. That's what we call about going to different synagogues and trying them out before committing to one place. Even if you've already committed to one place, you should go shul shopping. Try on different things if you can. So let's see some more questions that we have. Kathy says, I once walked into an Orthodox service by accident, and it was great. So yes, they can be fun. I've never seen men dancing together like that. It's awesome. Let's see. Chabad is a little different. Why is the wine sweet? I have a whole spiel on that. Maybe I'll come right back to it. Is there a dress code? Yes. So Kathy says, yes, conservative. She's got a big C, so maybe she means the conservative synagogue in her area is business casual. I think that's like a good way to put it, business casual. So the dress code at any synagogue is you should go in like wearing nice clothes. You don't have to wear a tuxedo or an evening gown or something like that, but you should dress sort of appropriate to the occasion. Like, how would you go to, if you've been to a church service, how would you go to church, right? If you work in an office, how would you go to that office if you wanted to make a good impression? Do you have to wear a suit and tie? Maybe not. But you should be dressed modestly. Like, your body should be covered. Like, no tank tops and shorts and flip-flops, right? There are some places like Venice Beach in synagogues, maybe you can get away with that because other people are there. but you should wear something that sort of dignifies your being and dignifies the occasion that you're in and isn't going to be like a big distraction for other people. They often say, and again, I have male privilege here, so if I wear a shirt with a collar on it and some not jeans, although sometimes I wear the jeans to show on the weekdays, but if I wear nice, decent clothes, I can get away with it. Women have different standards of dress. I would recommend having shoulders covered, for example. I would recommend having, let's say, if you're wearing slacks, you wear a longer skirt or something like that. So you should have your legs mostly covered, your shoulders covered. That's how I hear advice being given to women about that. So again, as a male, I get away with a lot of stuff, and I'm sorry for that, but that's just how it goes. And doing the best I can to make places more equal, more welcoming, more egalitarian. And again, that's just me. So let's see. Why is the wine sweet? That's a good one. So I read a great article on this a few years ago. Why is the wine sweet? Many times the answer is tradition. Okay, so got my Fiddler on the Roof out of the way. But here's what it said in the article that I read about why is the wine that you encounter at synagogues sweet. And these usually come in a bottle with a brand name like Manischewitz or Mogen David or something like that. I always thought it was funny that Mogen David, MD, had the same initials as Mad Dog 2020, and based on limited taste tests, they're not too dissimilar. It tastes like fortified wine. But the reason it's so sweet is that when a large, say, plurality of the Jewish population immigrated to America, and this happened between like 1850, there was a big German Jewish influx, and in the period from like 1880 to 1920, a lot of Jews settled in America from Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, places like that, and they immediately bumped into something called Prohibition. So this was a time in American history where the production of alcohol, the commercial production of alcohol, was illegal. However, religious groups could get exceptions for producing wine for what they called sacramental purposes. Now, we don't use that language. We more talk about mitzvot than sacraments, but same reason. So the Jewish immigrants who had largely settled in the Northeast, in the New York, New Jersey area, were allowed to grow their own grapes in order to make wine for Kiddush, right? In order to make wine for sacred purposes. The thing is, the only grapes native to that area or that would grow in that area were Concord grapes. Now, you might recognize Concord grapes from grape jelly, very popular in jelly. When you make wine out of it, and when you make wine out of Concord grapes, apparently the taste is what we would call today funky. And so the only way to make Concord grape wine palatable is to add a ton of sugar to it. Now, in jelly, which has a lot of sugar in it already, this is not such a problem. But if you're making wine out of Concord grapes, you have to add a ton of sugar to make it drinkable. And so thus the beginning of hechshered wine for sacramental purposes being manufactured by the Manischewitz Company and others was this Concord grape wine, because that's all that would grow there, with a ton of sugar added to it. And even though Prohibition is over with, that's the tradition that we've come up with. Now, can you make Kiddush with other kinds of wine? You absolutely can. However, many synagogues for so long have had this sweet wine that's what people think synagogue wine tastes like. And there was actually one time in my old congregation where I thought, hey, how about we have regular wine for Kiddush? And I got wine that was kosher, and I put it in all the little cups. And I even told people, okay, guys, this isn't Manischewitz. This isn't the sweet stuff. This is like wine out of a wine bottle that you might drink with your dinner. And even though I prepared them, as soon as we made Kiddush and everybody took a little sip of the wine, we were like, ugh, that's terrible. And it was like good wine. It was just not the sweet stuff that they were expecting. So, you do you. Try it out. I think it's an excellent cough remedy for when you really need it. But for the most part, I like making Kiddush with actual wine without a ton of sugar added. That's just me. Let's see what other questions we have here. Suzanne says, we go back to dress code. Suzanne says, I recommend wearing comfortable shoes. That is absolutely true. There could be a lot of standing, depending on what part of the service you're in for. But yes, comfortable shoes are good. We've got Val here again. We got Drake, new face. I don't know if I've seen Drake here before. What might someone of a non-Jewish background expect when visiting a Jewish congregation with respect to attendees approaching them? Excellent question. This you can ask whatever questions you like here tonight, especially on the topic of synagogue services, but this is really geared toward people who are just going to a synagogue for the first time, not knowing what to expect. And I'll say, Drake, it depends, right? It depends on what kind of place it is. Now, for the most part, my experience, when you go into a synagogue and you are a new face, many people are really excited to see a new person in their synagogue. I mean, some synagogues are struggling with membership for a little bit, and they're like, oh, there's a new person here. That's so great. And some places it's not that reason. They're just friendly, right? They're friendly. They're happy to see a new person there. And some places aren't. Like some places you go, they're not friendly, and that's just the nature of going to new places. Some places are wary of strangers. I hate to say it in this day and age. I mean, I feel like I have to modify my talk a little bit tonight because things are, in America anyway, are getting more and more secure. And in other countries, in Europe and in South America and Mexico City and places like that, synagogues have much tighter security than they do in the United States because they've been sort of a persecuted minority in that area. They've been subject to hate crimes and graffiti and things like that more often. And so often you'll go to a synagogue in another country and there will be an armed guard there and they will ask you for some identification or your passport. And if you did not call ahead to make arrangements letting them know that you would be there that day, they may not let you in. And I would say that was a thing for other countries, not in America until now, because the way things are in the world and with the rising anti-Semitic violence and crimes and things like that, you will see armed guards at synagogues. You will say, hey, people will ask you, what are you doing here if they don't recognize you? And that's just an unfortunate reality that we live in right now. But that is for the safety of that community. It has nothing to do with you. It is not personal, right? And it just happens to be that some communities experience problems with new people who come in, and so they may be wary of strangers. But for the most part, my experience is, if it's a place where you call ahead and you have called ahead, then they're going to welcome you. They may ask you questions they may ask you whether you're Jewish. And again, this isn't to exclude you or make you feel weird. It just happens, especially if you're there in the beginning of the service, that they may be trying to make minyan. That means minyan is a quorum for a Jewish prayer service. There are certain prayers that you can't say in the prayer service unless you have 10 or more Jewish adults present. And so, again, especially if you're there in the beginning and there's like 6 or 8 or 9 people there, they may say, hey, are you Jewish? Just so they know if they have a minyan yet. So again, don't take it personally. They're asking for their logistical reasons, and it has nothing to do with you. So let's say, so people may approach you, people may ask you your name, and it may be because you're a stranger and they like to know who you are. They may be wary of people coming, or they may just be friendly. They may ask you if you're Jewish, not because if you say no, they're going to kick you out. It could be if you say yes, I am Jewish, then they're like, whew, that's one more towards the minyan. We don't have to worry about quorum. If you say no, they may be fascinated. They may wonder, hey, what are you doing here? Like, they're not like, hey, what are you doing here? But more like, hey, cool. Really happy to have you in this service. Let me walk you through what you might expect. This is a siddur. This is a talit. Please cover your head, depending on who you are. So let's see what other questions we have. It's certainly understandable that security would be a major concern. Thanks for your response. Happy to really thank you for the question, Drake. Really enjoying this so far. I think I'm going to take a little bit of a pause from the Q&A just to get into some descriptions of the service, things that you might expect, and I'll break again for questions here in a moment. So, what might you expect the first time you are going to a service? I'm going to talk first about Friday night service because that's the first service a lot of people attend. I'll also talk about Saturday morning services because those are the first service that a lot of people attend, especially if you're there for what's called a Bat Mitzvah or a Bar Mitzvah celebration. And then I'll also talk about weekday services. Sometimes people go to synagogues for the first time on a weekday, and those services can be very different from what you'd expect on a Friday or Saturday night. First off, on a Friday night, like I said, you should go dressed, in respectfully. You don't. It's not like a black tie only. You go dressed, like you would go into a church, like you would go into an office where you work and you want to have a good impression on people. So go dress, nicely for whatever the standard is in your place. It's a little different in California, say, than it is in Upper West Side Manhattan, than it is in Upper East Side Manhattan, for example. So just go according to sort of the fashions and tastes and standards. Just dress in a dignified and modest way. You'll be fine. Feel free to go on time. Services like to start on time, although not everybody goes to services on time. That's more of a big deal on Saturday morning. I'll get to that in a minute. But if you go on a Friday night, services begin on time, people are more or less there, and there are two major parts to the Friday night service. There is what's called Kabbalat Shabbat, and then there is Mariv or Arvit. And the Mariv, that's the same, just about the same prayer service that you would have any given night. It's one of the 3 times a day we pray, but it's preceded by something called Kabbalat Shabbat. And Kabbalat Shabbat means accepting or receiving the Sabbath. This service was put together in the late Middle Ages by some mystics who were living in Sfat at the time, and they said, you know what? Yes, I love the evening prayers, but man, it's Shabbat. Can't we do something special? Can't we add to them? Can't we just meditate on Shabbat and welcome Shabbat and get in that mood before we do our evening prayers? And so they put together this little service of 7 psalms and a couple of additional songs. 7 is kind of the number of Shabbat because Shabbat's on the 7th day of the week, marking the end of the first week of creation. And so there are 7 psalms that lead up into the go through Kabbalat Shabbat. And there's additional songs like Ana B'Koach is a favorite one of mine. Much more common is Lecha Dodi. And Lecha Dodi means sort of, come my beloved. Like we're welcoming Shabbat in like a beloved, like a queen or a bride, welcoming them in honor. And so that's a very popular song. Many different tunes to it. For you music fans out there, it happens to be in 4/4 time, so you can put a lot of different tunes, and you will hear many different tunes for the same song, Lecha Dodi. All that is to say, once you come in on a Friday night, you are going to hear a bunch of singing right up front, right? There's several songs that go to the Friday night service. There'll also be some talking. If you go to, let's say, an Orthodox service or a conservative service, and even many Reform services, you will hear a lot of prayers in Hebrew. That's something you should be prepared for. I almost forgot that just because I'm so used to it. You will hear a lot of Hebrew being spoken and prayed and sung. And that is not a language that most people speak. In Los Angeles, we have quite a few native Hebrew speakers here, but not a lot of people are used to that. And so you'll walk in, and it's a little bit like I imagine back when Latin Mass was popular. I don't know much about Catholicism or Latin Mass, but it's a little bit like that. It is a prayer service being done in a sacred language that sounds very different from your vernacular and yet is preserving a tradition of that service. What I want to tell people, and I hope I'm not busting any myths or spoiling any secrets here, a lot of times when people go into a prayer service and they hear Hebrew being sung or spoken, it can be very alienating because it's hard to get into a holy mood or feeling connected to other people when there's a totally different language that you don't understand being spoken or sung. And part of that feeling is okay, everybody gets this but me. I'm the only one here who doesn't speak Hebrew and knows exactly what's going on. And I hate to tell you this, I'm spoiling secrets here, almost nobody has, with the exception of some, people who've been praying in that mode their whole lives or have studied Hebrew or are native Hebrew speakers from Israel or a place like that. Most people don't know, have perfect comprehension in what they're saying, but they've been saying the prayers for so long that they can sing the prayers, they can speak the prayers, or they can read it off the page. And I'm not saying that to bust on anybody. I'm saying that to help you feel at ease that you are not the only one who doesn't know what's going on. But you're going into a prayer service that has a traditional language to it, has traditional tunes to it, and I want to invite you to open yourself to it rather than feeling alienated by it. So you go to a Friday night service, You're going to have about a solid half hour of singing, depending on where you are, followed by, maybe there's a little break for what's called a Devar Torah, or a sermon, or a drasha, or a drash, what do they call it, a vort, different languages. But that's where the rabbi talks, or that's where, not necessarily a rabbi, but somebody will get up and teach some Torah, because that's an important part of Jewish services, is teaching and learning Torah. So we have singing, and then we have some learning, and then there's some more singing. And that's, my rabbi says, that's the structure of a proper Jewish prayer service. You sing, you learn, and you sing some more. So that's Jewish prayer in a nutshell. But it gets more complicated than that, trust me. Then you go into the evening prayer service of Mariv or Arvit, and that will start with the Baruch, which is a call to prayer. People are going to stand up. They're going to do some bowing. Just, if you don't know what's going on, either, just kind of watch respectfully, or try to imitate the movements yourself. Generally speaking, when people stand, you should stand. When people sit down, you should sit down. When you see people bowing, you should bow. And just, that's how you, if you plan on coming back, that's how you start learning how to do that stuff, is just imitation of people in the room. And once again, I said this, believe, on an earlier live stream, but there's something to that traditional mode, even if you don't understand it, even if maybe you don't necessarily agree with it 100%, there's something to having your body be in tune with the other people's bodies in the room that helps people feel connected, and people get in this rhythm and this meditative place. So that's a Friday night service. You have Kabbalat Shabbat, which is a bunch of singing. You have some learning in the middle, and then you have a bunch of praying with more singing. You'll have the Baruch Hu, you'll have a few blessings, you'll have the Shema, which is a very important Hebrew prayer. Starts Shema Yisrael. You will have a silent Amidah, especially this freaks people out if you walk in late and everybody's just kind of standing there, perfectly silent, or maybe holding a book and going like this a little bit. You can feel a little weird. If you've never seen anything like that before, you have probably walked in on the Amidah, and that's okay. You will get used to it, you will understand it, and pretty soon you'll be the one standing there silently when a stranger walks in and they're wondering what's going on. And then often a Friday night service will conclude with the Kiddush. And Kiddush is saying a blessing to God over a cup of wine, about sort of as a dedication of Shabbat. You can also make Kiddush at home as a part of your Shabbat meal. The reason people make Kiddush in synagogue services is, historically, the reason was that synagogues weren't just prayer spaces, they were also sort of lodging for people who were traveling a long way and had to stop overnight for Shabbat, because we're not supposed to travel on Shabbat. So there would literally be people sleeping in the synagogue that didn't have someplace else to go to make Kiddush. And Kiddush is a prayer that we say to sanctify the day and welcome in Shabbat. We use wine because that's a historical symbol for joy. You can also use grape juice if wine's not healthy for you. But you'll have, again, the singing, the learning, the singing and praying, and then Kiddush. And then afterwards there might be cookies, right? Or there might be challah or some refreshment. That's often called the Oneg Shabbat, which means delighting in Shabbat, which is what people call when people get together and have cookies and juice, or maybe some more wine, or maybe some harder stuff. I don't know, cake, things like that. So that's what you might expect on a typical Friday night service. It's not my experience, but it's my understanding that in Reform congregations, they may also have a Torah service during the Friday evening service. The reason for this is that for many congregations, especially Reform congregations, Friday night is the big service of the week, right? There may not be a Saturday morning service there, but they don't want to let the moment, they don't want to let the occasion of having a bunch of people there pass without learning some Torah. So in some synagogues, there may be the Torah taken out and read on a Friday night. You won't find this in most conservative or really any Orthodox places, but in a Reform place, you might have a Torah service, the Torah being opened up and read on a Friday night. So that's the Friday night service. Any questions about that, folks? We have one more question from Drake. Is there any part of the proceedings that a non-Jewish person should explicitly avoid participating in? I'm going to come back to that when we talk about Saturday morning, because yes, and it actually takes more of it has to do with Saturday morning and reading the Torah. When somebody comes up to you and asks you if you want an aliyah, and you're like, what's that? Okay. And only Jewish people should partake in that honor. So just I'm going to make you aware of that when we get to it. Let's see. Some people were asking about being buzzed in and security, things like that. Val says, "Kay, we have to get buzzed in and out as well. The synagogue here has been vandalized, and God forbid shot at multiple times. In addition, they have multiple armed guards for larger events and high holidays." So that gets back to the security questions. Some places have a gate that you might have to get buzzed in and out, and God willing, they're attending to that gate. I know that the synagogue that I used to be the rabbi of has since put in a gate that you have to be buzzed in and out even on Shabbat morning, because it's a smaller place. They don't have they don't have an armed guard necessarily, but they do have a security fence or security barrier. So that's just kind of life with the security situation we have now. Which is best to start with, Friday night or Saturday service? That's a good question. I got a similar question previously on what's the best service to go to if you can only go to one. And I say the service that you can go to is the best one for you. So we're about to talk about the Saturday morning service. I'm going to say typically the Saturday morning service is much more long and involved than the Friday night service. So if you go to an Orthodox synagogue or a conservative or some other traditional synagogue, the Friday night service will be 45 minutes to an hour. And this isn't true at every single place. I'm just talking about on average in my experience. The Friday night service will be about 45 minutes to an hour long. The Saturday morning service will be 2.5 to 3 hours long. Right? And you can get up and stretch your legs. It's not like you have to sit in one place the whole time. But I'm saying if you want to, I'll say a milder introduction, then go to the Friday night service. If you've got no place to be and you want to get the full Monty, experience, then I would say go to the Saturday morning service. I'm just going to say, don't tell Friday night I said this, but I far prefer the Saturday morning service myself. That's just because that's what I love, and I've been studying it for a long time. I know what's going on the whole time, so it's a little bit easier for me. It just breezes through. Also, I'm often leading it, so that it definitely goes fast there. So I prefer the Saturday morning service. But if you're looking for, say, a shorter starter experience, I would go to the Friday night service. But in general, my answer is whichever one you could get to is the right service for you. If you're like, if I say Saturday and you're like, oh, I can never go on Saturday, forget about it. And then you, or if I say it, or if I tell you to go to Friday, but you can never go to Friday, and that means you never go, that's the wrong answer. So whatever service you can get to is the right service to go to. If you want to go to a shorter service that's a little bit less involved to start with, I recommend the Friday evening service. So let's see what other questions we have here. With Drake's question about non-Jewish people participating, I'm going to jump right into the Saturday morning service because that question is more relevant there. Now, again, this is on average. This doesn't speak for every single place. Every place has its own custom, but by and large, Saturday morning service in the United States of America will start someplace between like 8:30 in more, let's say, traditional places, maybe 9:30 in the morning in other places. But it goes about 3 hours, about 2.5 to 3 hours, because the Saturday morning services are the kind of the longest and most involved services of a typical week outside of like holiday services. And they have many of the same parts that you would find in a weekday morning service. They have Psukei de Zimra, which is sort of some warm-up songs and psalms that we say before, to get us ready to pray. So we don't, we warm up so we don't pull something, so that our voices are full and our hearts are really focused before we start with the main prayer service of Shacharit, which starts with the Baruch Hu, which is a call to prayer, contains the Shema, which is our central declaration of faith in the unity of God, and also has the Amidah. And the Amidah on a Saturday morning service either could be silent, but will often be repeated aloud, or maybe the beginning will be sung and then people will pray silently. Sometimes they pray the whole thing silently, and then at the end they repeat the whole thing out loud. But in most places you go to, let's say, and I say most places, conservative synagogues are most of my experience, but Orthodox situations are very similar. That first part, from when they start until they're done with morning prayers before the Torah service starts, usually takes about an hour. And somebody is asking earlier about kind of jumping around in the Siddur. Again, a Siddur, which is a Jewish prayer book. Siddur means order, so it's like the order of prayer. Has the goal of a Siddur is to have every prayer in there you might want to say. Does that mean you will say every prayer aloud? Does that mean that every prayer will be repeated in the service? Not necessarily. Especially for starters, was the Siddur that was recommended to me was the Art Scroll Siddur, and that's typically used by more Orthodox congregations, and my conservative rabbi recommended it to me because it is the most comprehensive, but it also has great choreography. There's like little diagrams when you bow and stuff like that, which is very helpful. But now that I kind of know what I'm doing, I go use whatever Siddur is in the place, and I'm comfortable with it. Forgot what I was going to say there, but so the Siddur has all those things in there. All that is to say, the typical Saturday morning service, you'll be singing and praying for about an hour, and then the Torah comes out, and we have what's called the Torah Service. And this Torah Service will go, again, half an hour, 45 minutes, hour, something like that, depending on whether they do the full reading or the Triennial reading. But the first thing you'll notice is people kind of get up and sing, and then the ark opens and everybody stands up. The ark is that little cabinet in the front of the room that holds the Torah scrolls. Anytime that is open, people are supposed to be standing in honor of the Torah. Now, if you've never seen this Torah service before, it can feel a little bit weird. I'm just going to admit that, because you open it up and you see scrolls that are dressed in fine fabrics, may have tinkly like crowns on them with little bells and things like that, just really ornamented, something that's essentially like a parchment scroll with wooden handles, but it's really elaborately ornamented. And then everybody has to stand when the ark full of Torahs is open, or when the Torah is going around the room, and people touch it with the Siddur, or people touch it with the corner of their talus, and they kiss the whatever they touch it with. Some people will get up and kiss the Torah cover. That's more in like Sephardic congregations I found. But there is this exhibit of reverence for the Torah, which, if you haven't seen this before, might seem like we were worshiping the book like some kind of icon or, God forbid, idol. And I just want to dispel that feeling, because I'll say the first time I went to went to a synagogue, that's the feeling I got as well. Like, man, we are making a big deal out of a book. I thought we were, worshiping an unseen God. And it's not that, we're worshiping the scroll or anything like that. It's that we hold the law that we got from God in such high esteem that we pay a special kind of reverence to it when it is present. And so a big rule to follow is, if the ark is open, everybody who can stand up should stand up. When the Torah is kind of going around the room, it's considered bad form to turn your back on it, so you kind of track it as it goes around the room. Sometimes it's frustrating. I've seen congregations bring out two Torahs for special occasions, and then they go in different directions, and it's hard to not have your back to both of them at the same time. So you do you, but the general feeling is, it's like a dignitary is walking through the room, and you stand up when they're there, and you don't turn your back on them if you can avoid it, until the Torah is then placed on the reading table, and then everybody can sit down again. So again, the general rule is, if people are standing, you should stand, and if people are sitting, you should sit. But anytime the ark is open or the Torah is out and moving around, you should stand up. And once again, this isn't out of worshiping the thing. It's out of reverence for the law that God gave us. And so the Torah is down. You will hear, I'll say, 8 readings out. They say there's 7, but there's actually 8. So you'll have 7 aliyot, and then the maftir, meaning there's 7 readings, and then another reading that's sort of a repetition, a little bit of the last reading, and then the Torah scroll is picked up. This is something that's really a sight to see if you haven't seen it before. Somebody will pick up the Torah scroll and hold it up over their heads so that everybody can see hopefully the script. And if you've never seen a Torah up close, this is a good chance to see it. And then they roll it up and they wrap it up, and then somebody comes out and reads from the Haftorah. And just so you know, it's sometimes pronounced Haftorah. The Haftorah is not half a Torah. People make that mistake all the time. Haftorah means like an additional reading from the prophets. And so this is something from the Nevi'im, from the prophets, from the historical prophets or the later prophets that has been picked for that day. And so between the Torah reading and the Haftorah reading, that's sort of the reading and learning portion of the service. Somewhere in there, you might also hear a Devar Torah or a sermon. If the rabbi is there, if a guest teacher is there, or the cantor sometimes, somebody will get up and give a teaching drawn from this week's reading. And I should say, for people who aren't familiar, that we are in what's called a fixed lectionary or fixed lectory, a fixed lectionary where we're on a cycle of reading where every Jewish congregation in the world pretty much is reading the same passage of the Torah on a given week. Every once in a while when the calendar gets hinky, sometimes there might be like a week's difference in the cycle between Israel and the diaspora. But for the most part, every Jewish congregation in the world, every Jew in the world who's reading Torah is reading the same passage in a given week. For me, this is like a powerful connection that all Jews have, is that we're all literally on the same page every single week, which I think is pretty cool. So that's the Torah service. And then after the Torah service, there is, in many places, what's called an additional or a Musaf service. This is based on the fact that back in temple times, people would do an additional sacrifice on Shabbat and on holidays. And so after the morning service, after the Torah service, you would have an additional short service, which is an Amidah, which is another one of those standing quietly things. And then there are some usual concluding bits. You will have what's called Elena, which is a standing prayer where people just bow and they bow. You will have often the Kaddish Tom, or pretty much every service ends with the Kaddish Tom or the Mourners Kaddish. This is the exception to the rule, stand when everybody's standing. Because for the Mourners Kaddish, you will often only see a few people standing up, and these are people who are in mourning, who recently lost someone, or are marking the anniversary of losing someone, and this is a special prayer just for those people. Does that mean you can't say it if you're in mourning and you're there for the first time? You absolutely can. Just in the time, the person leading will say, whoever's in mourning, rise for this prayer, and you can rise whether you know how to say the prayer or not. You can rise with everybody else. Excuse me. I'll take a little drink of rocket fuel this evening. Good. But in some places, people will rise to say this mourner's prayer, and other people, even if they're not in mourning, will rise just to kind of stand with them. Some people always rise for this because of the Shoah, because of the Holocaust, and because on any given day, you can assume that there were thousands of people who perished, who no longer have family in the world to mourn for them. And some people will always say the Mourners Kaddish for that very reason, to mourn people who don't have people to mourn for them. And so that's usually the very last bit of services. After that, you might have some announcements, just, the sisterhood's sponsoring a brunch. We want to say thank you to the Green family for providing the cake and wine after services today. We've got a speaker series, all the little events that go on in any given community. They'll have announcements about that. And there's usually a song at the very end. It's often the song called Adon Olam, which is a medieval tune talking about both the immanence and the transcendence of God, sometimes sung to various tunes. Again, that's one thing that's in 4/4 time. Lots of different tunes for it. Sometimes some of them sound a little bit like Scarborough Fair. Sometimes you could sing it to like Yellow Submarine or something, but every place will have its tradition of the tune that they sing for that. And that's the Saturday morning service. And I'm going to jump into the chat. I've been talking an awful lot, folks, so I want to hear from you. Let's say I got my friend Carlos here. Let's see some new faces have joined us. Let's see. Going back in here, does every type of temple or synagogue use the same Siddur book? Excellent question. If a synagogue is a part of one of the big denominations, the big denominations usually have one or two or three different prayer books that are used within that denomination, and a synagogue will have one of those. So if you go to one Reformed synagogue or another, most likely, or when I say most likely, I'll say better than 50-50, they will have the same prayer book. Many conservative congregations have one of 2 or 3 common prayer books, And in Orthodox circles, sometimes people bring their own prayer book, or they'll have prayer books available in very traditional places. People kind of bring their own prayer books that day, and they might pray out of different prayer books, but they're all saying the same prayers. So it really depends. Let's see. I want to. Drake's just saying goodbye. Thank you for being with us, Drake. Mitch King asked a great question. Is phone use looked down upon on Shabbat? By and large, yes, I'll say, because, and this, again, how much it's looked down upon, like whether you're going to get shushed or kicked out of the building. I've never seen anybody like physically kicked out of a building for having a phone. But the idea of Shabbat, depending on what community you're in, on the one hand, in very traditional communities, people don't use electricity at all on Shabbat. Like if the lights are on, you leave the lights on. You don't mess with the thermostat too much. But using electronic devices is kind of frowned upon. So if you were going to, let's say, an Orthodox synagogue or a conservative synagogue or a traditional place, I would strongly urge you not to take your phone out. Nobody's going to yell at you, but it's a little bit disrespectful to the people of the place. And I say that, and then people take their phones out all the time. But I'll say, for your benefit, don't be that guy. Don't be the guy who takes his phone out. Other people can do that. My personal practice is I never try to embarrass anybody in public. That's a Jewish value that for me I take very seriously, is not embarrassing other people in public. So if I see somebody with their phone out, I'll be like, I may make like a little face or something, but I won't call them out where other people can hear them. I'll say, hey, why don't you look at that phone later? And like but I've had people in services like, hey, Rabbi, look at this great picture I have on my phone. And I'm like, I'll tell you what, I'm going to look at it later, buddy. Is that okay with you? If it's okay with me, if it's okay with you. So I would say in general, and then it's not just in Orthodox or conservative places, Reformed places as well. Part of Shabbat is, even if you don't cotton to the no electronic devices thing, it's about presence, right? It's about you are there. Be with the people who are there. You are there in that moment with really nothing else to do. And that's part of what makes Shabbat special, is that there's nothing else to do. There's no expectations on you, right? You are released from your worldly obligations for 24, 25 hours. See if you can take a break from the electronic devices. And so this is just me endorsing. I'm not going to judge anybody. I'm not going to tell you you're bad or anything like that. But I think for people who are on their phones 24/7, and I am guilty, right? Like this is my life. Like I am on my electronic devices all the time. I teach Torah on the internet, for crying out loud. So I am always on some kind of electronic device. I've got this one. I've got this one. I've got this one over here. But I relish the opportunity to let go of that stuff on Shabbat. So if you can leave it at home, if you drive to the synagogue, that's another question somebody probably has. Leave it in the car. Just try to be in the moment and be present with the people you are with, and give yourself a break, right? Because we don't do that often enough, I think. So that's just my 2 cents for you. I will say, if you are visiting a synagogue for the first time, just to be safe, leave your phone at home, leave your phone at the car, just don't take it in with you until maybe you get to know the place. If you're at a place where it's like, hey, everybody, let's live tweet the sermon, there are probably places like that. So next time you go, you can live tweet the sermon. But I would say if you were, and that's kind of the basis of this video, if you were going to a synagogue for the first time, leave your phone outside someplace. The world will be fine, and you will be fine for an hour. Look, if you're a doctor, if you're like on call for a transplant or something, do what you need to do. That's Jewish as well. Like if having your phone on you will literally save your life or somebody else's, if you're a police officer, if you are a physician, if you are awaiting a kidney transplant, you take what devices you need. Otherwise, dude, give it a break. Like, I mean, that's just me giving you permission to free yourself from your electronic device for a little while. And I say that as someone who teaches Torah through electronic devices. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Carla gave a great answer to the same question. She says, depends on the community. At my Reformed community, the rabbi tells us to take out phones and go to sites. My conservative community, people hide phones if they bring them at all. Sometimes they use them in the parking lot. Let's see. Alexandria, Virginia says, when I went to a synagogue before, they did what you described, bringing the Torah around and then reading from it. A Reformed synagogue near me bows and prays in front of the open ark, but it doesn't look like they take out a scroll. That's right. Sometimes places for different prayers, they'll open the ark as kind of an open, like opening oneself up, symbolically by opening up the place that holds the law. We're kind of opening up the gates of heaven, if you will. And for some prayers, people will bow toward the open ark as this kind of direct access to God with maybe the Torah there as a proxy. Totally common, totally legit. Let's see. It doesn't look like they take out the scroll. They definitely don't parade it around. So it looks like this is what I'm really proud of. I'm just gonna here. I don't like calling people out. I don't like embarrassing people, but I'm going to call out some folks, or rather, call out a general thing that I'm seeing, and that is people answering each other's questions in this chat. There is no greater joy for a rabbi than students teaching each other in these moments. And so thank you for everybody who's pitching in, answering each other's questions. I love to talk, I love to teach Torah, but I really love it when people are in this space and answering each other's questions. That's what I love about the Jew Curious School where I teach. That's what I love about this community here. So keep up that good work. People are asking about, let's see, Suzanne says, I started doing Shabbat and sometimes turning off electronics because of you. I don't know who the you is. I hope she's talking about Hashem. Kathy says Orthodox don't drive or ride in cars on Shabbat. That is true. So you will see it's by and large true. I'll say that way. I mean, I know again, I'm not going to tell stories on people, but don't assume that of any religious community that everybody acts in the same way. Just going to put that out there, so that if you see people acting differently than you expect, that's because they are humans. So many people have different practices. You might find people in Reformed synagogues that have very traditional Shabbat practices, but feel more comfortable at a and feel more comfortable at a Reformed synagogue. You might find people who feel most comfortable in Orthodox prayer spaces, and they may or may not have the same Shabbat, kashrut, what have you, observances at home. They just really like Orthodox prayer services. So there's the whole gamut there. I mean, where people go to pray often says less about their personal theology than their preference for a particular teacher, or that's where their friends go. And so I just want people to be kind of open to that. I don't want to say, okay, an Orthodox service is always like this, a conservative service is always like this, etc. Just go and experience it for yourself and go in with low stereotyped expectations. I want to talk, we've been learning together for about 52 minutes now, so I want to make sure I cover things like what might be different for a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah service, and then we'll get to weekday services as well. If you are going to a service where people are celebrating a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, that is a child coming of age in the Jewish tradition, you may be, I got an invitation to a bar mitzvah. That's kind of shorthand for a bar mitzvah celebration. The bar mitzvah is the child, or the bat mitzvah is the child, and bat is feminine, bar is masculine, just grammatically. But a part of this coming of age is a child leading certain prayers or reading certain readings that children don't read, but once they come of age, 12 years old for girls, 13-year-olds for boys, although in some communities they just do 13 for everybody because they're all in the same class at school, for example. Once a person reaches that age of legal majority, they are now eligible to lead prayers for other people and read sacred readings for other people, and so they mark that occasion by doing those things. And so if your first time in a synagogue is because you got an invitation to a friend, coworker, what have you's bar mitzvah, then that service may look a little bit different sometimes. If the Normally you might have adults doing everything, but in a bar mitzvah service, a child might be leading prayer services or reading from the Torah or doing some of the readings, not the whole thing. Sometimes the kids do the whole thing. Those are some sharp kids. You know what I'm saying? There's some places where kids will lead the entire thing, and it really has to do with like the strengths and the gifts of the child and how long they've been preparing. There's no right or wrong way necessarily, but if you go into a service and there's a child leading everything, it's probably her bat mitzvah or his bar mitzvah. Another thing that's really common to bar mitzvahs, and I was saying this earlier, if you're going on a Friday night for the first time, go on time. If you're going on Saturday morning for the first time, you should also go on time, but expect that you will be very lonely because the Saturday morning service is often super duper long, like 2.5, 3 hours in some places. Some folks don't get there right at the page one. Many people don't come until the Torah service. Some people come a little bit later in the morning prayers, and that's typical. So if you come into a synagogue and you know there's a service there that day, but there's like 3 people, you are not in the wrong place. You just have gone into a place where there's sort of like a first seating and a second seating, like in a restaurant, or people sort of filter in for that first hour. And it's often common, especially if people are coming for the first time, they look at the invitation, what the time is there, they think that's when the service starts, and the service actually does start then. It's just people who come there regularly may come a little bit later. I'm not encouraging that behavior. I'm just saying, don't be surprised. You are in the right place. You will see more people as the day progresses. So that's something you might see at a bar mitzvah service. You'll see a bunch of people who are there on time holding those invitations, and like 2 dudes up front, like the 2 regulars, or the person leading the prayer service, or a small number of people. That crowd will grow, so get a good seat while you can. And then you will see a child leading part of the service or doing some of the readings and getting an awful lot of attention, especially if it's a bar mitzvah. This also happens at an off-roof, which is like a pre-wedding ceremony. For various occasions, people in synagogues sometimes throw candy. So be prepared for that. If people are throwing candy, it's not weird. It's just something that happens at some service. We like to shower the bat mitzvah child or the bar mitzvah child with sweetness, reinforce the sweetness of what it means to be a Jewish adult by throwing candy at them. So that's something that happens. Feel free to stuff your pockets with the candy. It's just like everybody else is. So there's that. What else is going on here in the chat? So many people. Oh, great questions about kippot. Maybe bring up kippah, how to put it on, how to use the clips, etc. So a kippah is one of these things. It's okay I'm not wearing one now, because it's people who follow that rule say you shouldn't walk more than 4 cubits with your head uncovered. Cubit is approximately 18 inches, so don't walk 6 feet. I am sitting still, so I'm totally okay right now. But a kippah is this. It's also called a yarmulke, which is a Yiddish word for a head covering. A kippah is Hebrew for dome. It's a little dome-shaped thing. And it's our custom to wear one of these to acknowledge the presence and the sovereignty of God at all times. In some cultures, it's considered respectful to remove your head covering in certain places. Like I know in Christian churches, for example, people will take off their hat when they enter the building. In Jewish circles, we actually cover our heads for the dignity of God and for the dignity of the people around us. And so, and again, the custom about, whether have a kippah, who wears a kippah, varies widely between different congregations. In some congregations, so the most traditional settings, men wear kippahs, women do not. Women may cover their head in another fashion. You might go and see, I don't have one here because I don't wear them, but some places you go, they'll have a basket of kippot, that's the plural, up front, and there'll be like these little kind of almost disposable jobs. There's like very flimsy ones. I always wear my own. I'm not trying to brag. I just happen to have a lot of them. That's kind of my deal. And then you have little clips that hold them on. So I like this one. This one was a gift, and you can't really see it on the camera, but this one is also a multi-tool. It's got like a little saw blade right there and a tiny little screwdriver for glasses, and theoretically you can even open a bottle with this end, but I haven't had success in there. Again, not bragging, just a cool gift I got one time. But it holds on to my head. People ask all the time questions. Okay, for dudes who have no hair on top, how do you get the Kippah to stay on? And I've heard that double-sided tape is not a joke. That's a real thing that happens. So people put on double-sided tape or something like that. I'm sure, I don't know if you could tell, I will learn someday, not in the very far future, how to wear a kippah when I don't have any hair on top. Just part of growing up, I guess. But so again, in many congregations, people cover their head or their hair for various reasons. In traditional places, some men wear these all the time. Some only wear them when praying or eating. That was sort of Maimonides' ruling on this. Like, you should have your head covered when you pray. And the fact is that when we eat, we also say blessings and Birkat Hamazon prayers afterwards. And so you should have a kippah on while you're eating, because you're probably also going to be praying at that time. And then some people wear them all the time. Nobody wears them all the time. Like, we don't sleep in them. We don't swim in them or bathe in them. I do know, so like, I don't wear mine at the gym, for example, because it would just get messed up. But I know people who will also have their head covered at the gym, for example. And so in some congregations, only men wear these. In some congregations, men and women wear these. In some congregations, nobody wears these. Sort of classical German Reform congregations from the 1850s and forward, it was considered a custom not to, as sort of an expression of the theology of that place. And so my advice to you, if you were going to a synagogue for the first time, and there is a basket of head coverings out there, grab one. And you can't go wrong. If there are head coverings present, you can't go wrong wearing one. If you're comfortable wearing one, it's not if you're not Jewish, it's not considered disrespectful to not wear one. In fact, many places, especially for bar mitzvahs, they have them there. Whether you're Jewish or not, it's considered respectful to have one on when you enter the prayer space. And so if there's a basket there with yarmulkes, put them on. If there's a basket there that has these sort of lace doily things, this is something that's worn by women in some places. If you're a woman and you put one of these lace doily things on, nobody's going to be mad at you. So might as well give it a try. Just try on the custom of the place, see how it feels, see how it fits, and you'll decide whether you want to do it again when you come back. So that's something about kippot. Again, this kind of follows the trend of, if you are comfortable, imitate what other people are doing, and you won't feel so out of place. Now, I want to answer the question. I think it was Drake who asked this question. He's not on now, but maybe he'll watch it later. What can you do if you are not Jewish? So one thing, you can do just about anything. There are a few things that you can't do. One thing that's very important, you cannot count in a minyan. And I said this in the beginning. Somebody may ask you when they see you, are you Jewish? And I've never had the experience where somebody says, oh, you're not, and then they kicked you out. And he's like, showed you the door, right? It's not like, I think in the Mormon church, there are certain places in like the Mormon temple that only Mormons, like confirmed Mormons, have access to. Jewish spaces are not like that. Anybody can be there. Some places have different rules about non-Jews being present on the bima, on the kind of the altar or the high place up in the front. Generally speaking, if it's your first time there, they're not going to ask you to do that anyway. But they may ask you if you're Jewish just to make sure they're making quorum, right? And so if you're not Jewish, be honest about it, because they don't want to count you in this quorum. And that's not like being mean or anything. It's just like, we need 10 Jews to say certain prayers. And the nicest thing you can do is to be honest and say, you're going to have to wait for one more person before you make minyan. And they'll be cool with that. And I hope you'll be cool with that as well. Another thing that often happens when a new person enters a synagogue is that the synagogue will want to honor them, as a way of being welcoming to guests, with what's called an aliyah. An aliyah, if somebody asks you if you want one and you're not Jewish, say no thank you. Because this, what that means is they're asking you to come up during the Torah service and say the blessing before and after the Torah reading. First off, if this is your first time in a synagogue and you're not Jewish, you're not going to know the words to say, and you're probably not going to be able to read along. And so that will be kind of an embarrassing moment for you, and I don't want anybody to feel embarrassed. Second off, that's in most places that's something that's reserved for Jewish people to do, because you are leading the congregation. For a split second, you are leading the congregation in prayer. You're saying prayers that other people say amen to, and that is reserved, again, in most places traditionally for Jewish people. So if it's your first time, say no thank you. You can say you're not Jewish, and nobody will be, and I hope you're not embarrassed by that. They won't be embarrassed by that. They're not going to be like, oh, cooties, get out. Nothing like that. Just be honest and be respectful. And most congregations that I know of are delighted to have non-Jewish people come. We're like grateful that people who aren't Jewish would want to come to this 3-hour service and hang out with us. That's really cool. And we're also delighted when people who aren't Jewish come and see our traditions, because we're delighted to show everybody that we're just like you. We're just like, we're just like everybody else. Our services may be a little bit longer, but we don't sacrifice animals anymore. We don't sit there, saying mean stuff about people who aren't Jewish. Most, good places don't anyway. So we're happy to have people who aren't Jewish in our services to see what we do. Look, if you come in and you have a spiritual connection at that point, own it. Like, that is legit. Enjoy your spiritual connection in that place. Sometimes people then come back and then come back again, and they feel drawn to that kind of prayer setting, and they may feel drawn toward Judaism. I'm not putting the hard sell on you right now, buddy. I'm just saying that non-Jews are welcome in Jewish spaces for the most part. Again, there could be outliers to this, places that are really scared for security reasons, but by and large, non-Jews are welcome in Jewish spaces. There are certain parts of the prayer service you can't lead. So just if people ask you if you're Jewish, be honest about it. You could say, nope, I'm Jew curious. You tell them I said so. Say, I'm Jew curious, or I'm just learning about this. I'd rather just observe today. That's okay too. And 9 times out of 10, people are going to be delighted to have you. They're going to be very welcoming. They'll be happy to explain to you. They may be like all up in your face because they're like, hey, wow, let me teach you this. Let me show you what page we're on. Again, your mileage may vary. You may go to some place where the person by the door is having a bad day and they give you a dirty look. That's not because they're Jewish and you're not. That's because they're human and you are too. And we all have bad days. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Let's see. We've got a lot of questions about driving. Kathy asks, what do you think of ladies wearing kippot? I don't know if she's asking me or asking other people. Let's see. Lexi says, I personally think, Kathy, why not if a woman wants to? I think it's a great personal preference. I agree with you 100%. I agree with you, Kathy and Lexi. I also know that in some congregations, especially places, for example, where men and women sit in different places, that's the kind of place I wouldn't, if I were a woman, I wouldn't put a kippah on just to be difficult or different. But I also know women who go into those spaces and challenge the status quo for good reason and for good effect. So again, if you're just visiting a place for the first time, I would follow the customs of the place. This may sound patriarchal or not egalitarian or whatever. If you are visiting a place for the first time, I recommend following the customs of the place. And if you don't like the customs of the place, don't go back. If you feel really, very much at home there and are a part of a community, and you want to challenge the status quo as somebody who's part of that community, I also encourage you, because that's where that kind of challenge is most effective, is coming from somebody who is committed to the health of that place. And so probably getting out of the subject of this video a little bit, but just wanted to throw that out there. Let's see. People my wife has a kippah. Sometimes in some places, women have these kippahs that are made of like wires and jewels and stuff and beads that are put together. It looks like a kippah, but it's very different from like the knit fabric ones that I have. I don't know if anybody wants me to talk more about the whole driving on Shabbat thing. We've had a lot of discussion in there already. I will say I'm a part of the conservative movement that several decades ago came out with a tshuva, a legal ruling that says, we have a couple of competing values. One is it's good to pray in a community on Shabbat. Another value is it's good to follow the traditional restrictions on behavior that help preserve Shabbat. And those restrictions on behavior include not lighting fires and not carrying stuff and not riding something. And back when those rules were written, they were talking about horses, right? Because they thought, okay, if you're riding a horse, you may be inclined to pull a branch off a tree to use as a switch or a whip for that horse. And so the principal rule for not riding was it might cause you to break a branch off a tree, which was like harvesting, which is something that we don't do on Shabbat. So that's why we don't ride. But the other things that go with cars are most cars are still our internal combustion engines. So you're literally creating a fire or several fires per second. You are lighting fires constantly while you're driving a car. And the other thing is you might have some stuff in your trunk, or you might have some stuff in the glove compartment, and then that would be that you were carrying stuff. So there's all sorts of reasons not to drive a car on Shabbat. However, since, let's say, the mid-1940s, 1950s, especially when all these folks came back to the war and started having more babies, there was mass suburbanization of America. More and more synagogues were either being built out in the suburbs where people live farther and farther apart, or actually where this started was the synagogues that were in the cities, people moved out of those cities into the suburbs. And they wanted to go to the same synagogues, but they couldn't afford to live in that neighborhood anymore. They could get a really nice big house for all those messy kids they were having out in the suburbs, but they still wanted to go to their old synagogue. And maybe there wasn't a new synagogue in their neighborhood. So the question was, is it more, we decide between competing values all the time, right? Pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat. That's a principle whereby you can break just about any Shabbat rule and most other mitzvot as well if you're doing it to save a human life. Right? So Shabbat's important, human life's important. 99 times out of 100, human life wins. Right? There's some very few particular exceptions to that. That's a different video. Praying in a community is important. Being together with fellow Jews on Shabbat is important. Not driving is also important. And so the conservative movement looked at this and they said, okay, if you can avoid driving, you should avoid driving. If the only way that you're going to pray with other Jews and spend Shabbat with other Jews is by getting in your car and going there, we're going to leave that to the standards of the community in which you reside. And there are places today, traditional places, that will literally chain their parking lot on Shabbat to discourage people from driving there. And as some people have observed in this chat, there are people who belong to traditional synagogues and traditional conservative or Orthodox synagogues who will drive most of the way to the shul, park, and then walk the last 2 blocks. Again, I'm not telling stories about people, just that's the reality of the situation. There are also people who belong to conservative or reform or other synagogues with big parking lots and lots of people who drive there who prefer to walk, who choose to walk, right? Because that's how they want to express their Shabbat, and that is just as prevalent as well. And so my advice to you is, if this is something that's really troubling for you, you want to be a part of a community, you can only get there by driving, or you want to challenge yourself to say, hey, maybe I can walk, or maybe I can stay with somebody close by, and that could be part of my Shabbat practice as well. I would say talk to the rabbi of that community. Now, I'm not like shutting people out. If you want to talk to a rabbi, you can always talk to me. But if you're talking about a particular synagogue, a particular community that you want to be a part of and express your Shabbatness there, then talk to that rabbi, because they're going to know that place best and what other people do and can walk you through that very personal decision. So the last thing that I want to cover today, just because I said I would, is what to expect when you go to a weekday service. Now, traditionally, Jews have 3 prayer services a day: morning, afternoon, and evening. In most synagogues, in some places, like in yeshivas or kollels or, Batei Midrash, where they pray in a study hall, you might still have distinct morning, afternoon, and evening prayers. Most synagogues, if they have an afternoon or evening prayer service, they will merge those two things. They'll have like a late afternoon prayer service, which is kind of around sundown, so you can get your your afternoon prayers and your evening prayers done at the same time or close together. And they might have a separate morning service as well, because there's really no joining morning with the other ones because they're just too far apart. Why might you be going to a weekday minyan for the first time, or a weekday prayer service for the first time? This often happens when people lose somebody, And part of the custom of mourning is to say Kaddish every day for the person you have lost for a distinct period of time, right? If it is a close relative who's not a parent, who's not one of your parents, I should say, you will say Kaddish every day for them for 30 days. If it is a parent who has passed away, then you will say Kaddish every day for them, traditionally for 11 months. And so this is many people's introduction. Even if you've never been to a synagogue or haven't been to one in a long time, this is many people's introduction to what's called the weekday minyan. Now, minyan just means quorum, but it's usually kind of a small gathering of people. The weekday services, if you go to a synagogue, they are shorter, right? So the morning services are typically 30 to 40 minutes long. People come in, they do all the prayers they have to as quickly as they can because most folks have to go to work that day. And so this is a much shorter service where people are praying in Hebrew. They're praying very fast. Sometimes they may be wearing tefillin, which are those, phylacteries is a terrible translation, but they're those black boxes on the arm and on the head with the straps and the talit. So the services usually go about 30 to 40 minutes on a typical weekday morning, and that's by weekday I mean Sunday through Friday. On Mondays and Thursdays, there's an additional Torah reading as a part of the service. There's just a very brief Torah service with 3 aliyot. That's 3 readings instead of 7 or 8. So that may take 45 minutes or an hour instead of 30 to 40 minutes. So that's what a weekday service is like. They're usually very early in the morning. I think the sun has to be up first, but they might happen right after that. Especially in traditional places, they'll happen right after sunup so that people can then get on with, maybe do some learning or studying, but then get on with their workday. So the best thing to do is, call the synagogue, say, hey, do you have a weekday service? And if they do, check it out, but just know that it's going to be early and it's going to be shorter than your typical services. In the evenings, again, call the synagogue. They have different policies. That was what time those are vis-a-vis sundown and things like that. Those services, again, are sort of statutory services. They're there for people who are saying Kaddish because that's their custom, or they're for people who like to pray in a minyan 3 times a day. And so that's kind of the bare bones according to Hoyle. They'll do all the prayers they have to as quickly as they can, typically. That's how it is. I'm not trying to detract from its holiness, but it's much more filled with people who are knowledgeable prayers, with less explanation, less elaboration than on a Shabbat, where you have more people who don't pray, or where you are more likely to encounter people who don't pray on a daily or 3 times a day basis. And there's more explaining, and there's a little bit more drawn out because you have time to luxuriate for Shabbat. So again, weekday prayer services are typically shorter and much more likely to be all in Hebrew, less likely to encounter a sermon unless somebody just wants to talk for like 5 minutes to illuminate a Torah portion, something like that. So that's been a lot of stuff. We've had some great people. I've seen Carla chime in. I've seen Milo join us from Denmark, I believe is where Milo is coming from. So we have so many continents here tonight. We have, I think, somebody from New Zealand. Somebody's in from Wellington. I think that's New Zealand, if I'm not wrong. So really, really, really delighted. We've got Cyprus, New Zealand in the house. We've got Denmark. We've got we've got Arcadia, California in the house. We've got Fullerton. So many people. I really appreciate all the great questions that we've had tonight. This is going to make a fantastic episode of the Jew Curious Show podcast, and I owe it all to you guys. Thank you so much, Jew Curious people, and I will catch you on the podcast. Until then, peace.